Amy Greenberg, is story which happened, or a aluminum foil for disgusting acts and beliefs. Is story, as the period is creature utilized in policy discussion these latter weeks and months, a recording of the history how will stay up to purpose study, or is the perceivable authority of story creature utilized as a aluminum foil for disgusting acts and beliefs. But to say how take downward a image of Robert E. Lee is take off whose story, I'm not though certainly which how tool. One item I'm rather certainly of is how Robert E. Lee was not precisely the identical as George Washington. One dedicated above 25 years of his lifetime to creation a republic the likes of that story had never named, and for his victim obtained the name Dad of his nation. This was a betrayer. Lee took up weapon versus the joint state guideline uprising how was accountable for the deaths of above 600,000 Americans, and was conquered. The reality how Robert E. Lee wasn't suspended as a betrayer was thanks to the kindness of the U.S. by the government. I will recognize how I'm not certainly yet precisely which the part of story is in all of the affirmative. On one brush human beings are speaking a lot on story, but while neo-Confederates say on story, are they though speaking on story as I aware and learn and compose it, a episode of events how happened in the history, that can be virtually registered and discussed via the purpose review of source? Affirmative, he's real how George Washington belonging slaves. But he, in comparison with shelter, lived in an era while bondage was a acknowledged reality in each settlement. That did not halt George Washington of release his slaves in his will, a wonderful motion for his period and location. But later once again, I'm not certainly nobody who claims how George Washington and Robert E. Lee were precisely the identical in fact believes how to be real. Amy S. Greenberg is Edwin Orrell Splash's prof of a story at Penn Country College. An confer-winning writer of 4 persons books, consisting Evil Warfare, Polk, Mud, Lincoln and the 1846 U.S. Intrusion of Mexico, branded books, 2013, she has written a life story of at first Dame Sarah Childress Polk, to be published by Knopf in 2018. Karen Coxon, generalizations cannot determine the southward. The southward is really frequently a wrong area, particularly for such who don't aware its story. The is real if one grew up there or thinks he or she understands the southward, and southerners of TV shows, the movies or news story audio bites. Relying on perceptual, the area is mined to be unconditionally prudent politically and social, smart back and bigot. Culturally, it gets honor for its meal, its piece of music and how omnipresent item named Southern Welcome. As a historiographer of the southward who often writes on Southern civilization, and as who has lived there with I was a child, I would love human beings to aware how the area cannot be certain in such a generalizations, any more than rather than one could explain all Europeans as possessing particular traits. Largest human beings would accept how the Germans and the France are rather various. Taking into account the geographic width of the southward, the identical holds real for the differences among human beings of Northern Virginia and such who dwell in East Texas, both of that are deliberate portion of the southward. Which I'd as well love for human beings to know is which is intended by the period Southern. So frequently, down there's an main supposition how a Southern is a white's evangelic. The couldn't be future of the true. Generations of dark Southerners, Hebrew Southerners, Hellenic Southerners and other include helping to form the area. Creature Southern is as lot a portion of their sameness as their racing or religious. Southern story is as well their story. The variety of the southward extends to its policy. Time the southward tends to choose prudent political community to office space, the is frequently a reflect of the city/rural share how can be found through the otherwise of the nation. The southward is really village, and love village populations external of the area, it tends to voice more than modestly. Yet, down there are lot exceptions to how guideline. City areas there tend to voice for more than advanced candidates. Human beings who dwell in Charlotte, Atlanta, New Orleans and some cities in the area tend to voice rather otherwise rather than their village peer pressure. Our story in Racing Relations, of year, has profiled the area with up the basis of the nationality. bondage, Jim Blackbird, and modern clashes above racing yet pestilence the southward, but in the we are not one. Historic, these include as well been domestic concerns, although largest Americans see fit to spot their fingers at the southward and appoint accuse. Trust me, down there is lot to go about. Eventually, as events in Charlottesville shown, Southerners include a broad band of opinions while it comes to accomplice monuments. In comparison with the Jim Blackbird era, while such markers of Southern legacy were famous by the whole white society, lot modern Southerners discover themselves at prospect in how legacy. Karen L. Cox is Prof of Story at the College of Polar Carolina at Charlotte and the basis CEO of the grade Social Story program. She is the writer of repeated books on Southern story and civilization, largest newly, Nanny Goat Lock, A Real History of Assassination, Racing, and the Goth Southward. James Grossman, Why Can't Such Enforce Fair Recognize the Confederation Was a Bad Concept. The ramifications of the tragic in Charlottesville has undressed the front of a scenery of domestic dispute, but has as well stipulated and prospect. On the one brush, we see an obvious toleration for historic darkness, but on the some, down there is a renovated domestic concern in the subtleties of story and rem. Big some portion of the social, consisting the print, dong ti aware the story of the Confederation, the civilian warfare, or how lot of the accomplice monuments came to already exist. So they are discussion if or not to wipe a story how they dong ti aware really so. Which's as well tragical is the failure of our CEO to complete one easy verdict, this Confederation was a bad concept. As a historiographer, I believe we should all be capable to accept how Alexander Stevens exactly summed the person-accomplice state declarations of exit. We can claim during our communities on the interpretative and politics implications of how easy reality or on the public issues main debates above the destiny of these monuments. But think if all 535 members of convention and the CEO of the joint state would fair say this Confederation is a bad concept, and later keep it to state and communities to discussion the implications for social civilization and politics. James Grossman is the execution CEO of the US Historic Associate. Before defect CEO for Study and Formation at the Newberry Public Library, he is the writer of Earth of Expect, Chicago, Dark Southerners and the Large Migrating and Some Plant. Peniel Joseph, Story's Largest Durable Class. Changing Happens of the Lower Up Our Modern Race Scenery, giving a comical book release of our morbidly murderous story, gentle peddling the race abuse, conquest, and hate related in the Confederation in benefit of a cuttlefish-toned picture of sturdy and boldly daring heroes dedicated to the lose reason. The contemporary civilian rights fight converted the nationality exactly since it rejected to mythologies the story of whites' leadership or do the coarse places sleek in our domestic story. The fight to build which Martin Luther Tsar Jr. named a favorite society require morbid true-telling, to both of the strong and the impoverished. How class remnant particularly resonance in our own period, as a dazed nationality watches in terror as an CEO waste the concept of race judiciary as portion of the nationality's religion. As a historiographer privileged to learn, study and compose on the length dark liberty fight for virtue, judiciary and equity, it is mandatory how we recall our comrade countrymen of all backgrounds on the sacred land of us democratic state. The links among racing and democratic state stay at the center of our domestic history, a deep bustling legend how frequently found the nationality fighting to conciliate ideals of liberty and freedom in the gloomy fact of race bondage, Lynch and Jim Blackbird. The civilian war provided a determining time in our youthful nationality's story, an era whose heritage continues to be seen in the speckled residue scars how occur above accomplice statues, fight flags and attribute how communicate history and this in awkwardly lighting ways. In spite the tragical events in Charlottesville and the overwhelming fail of president management in its wake up, we include cause to be upbeat. Story's largest durable class is how changing happens of the lower up, enterprising institutions, organizations and affirmative, though presidents to capture up in public movements needing judiciary. Reimagining us democratic state in the 21st age requires the private and policy adulthood to recognize the deep and width of race inequity. Time recognition, the reality how the present indignation above the Seo's color-deaf processing of the Charlottesville tragic is reflecting of a type of advance how we should never disregard. Penuel Joseph is the Varvara Jordan, armchair in policy values and ethical and the basis CEO of the Center for the Research of Racing and Democratic State at the LBJ High School of Social Sphere at the College of Texas at Austin, wherever he is as well a prof of story. Kevin Levin, Charlottesville is a play changer in the Accomplice Memorial discussion. For such of us next the Accomplice Memorial discussion, the abuse in Charlottesville was a play changer. The assassination of Heath Heyer will include the identical effect on the urge to shoot accomplice monuments as the terrible events in Charleston did 2 years ago on the screen of the Fight banner. Baltimore rapidly remote 4 persons monuments and Lexington, Kentucky, on in some towns and cities, will largest surely pursue. Up Charlottesville down there was a opportunity how cities love Richmond, that has done and forced to add monuments to its memorable scenery and retain essential historical sites associated to bondage, would be capable to manage a year how avoiding remove of its accomplice monuments. Mayoress LeVar Stoney hoped to manual his town to fare the finding in shaping a committee to investigate the possibilities of addition background to Memorial Prospect. He newly fixed the position and will now believe remove as a probable decision. So which happened? The whites' nationalist gathering in Charlottesville vulnerable, which has ever been the basic issue of if Robert E. Lee or any some memorial represents the joint values of the society. How was surely the instance while the Lee Memorial was devoted in 1924, but how was completed as a outcome of legislative segregationist, that prevented any entry of the town's African American people. The story infused in accomplice monuments became an instrument to excuse and support whites' leadership. Lack in the joint ram provided in these monuments was any acceptance how Lee and some Confederates were readily to offer their lives to build an freelance slave republic constructed on whites' leadership. The festivity of whites' leadership is which driven neo-Nazis to Charlottesville in defense of the Lee Memorial. They cleaned the regulation of the discussion. Telephone call for historic markers and some mild solutions will do anything to suppress a discussion how will assist to reply the issue of who we are as a society and as Americans. Gen Incense, accomplice memorials are ahead in female story, 2 deceased in 1865 and 1866 in southern towns and cities, whites female created lady monument associations, LMAs, that sponsored whites society marches to the graveyard to adorn soldiers' graves. In supplement to identification and driving accomplice soldiers remnant of in isolation locations, the LMAs stipulated serious markers. Above lot year the Raleigh and Richmond societies pay to vessel bodies of Gettysburg to be reinterred in southern ground. Such a groups as well grown cash to set up memorials in the cemeteries, that at first were arches, obelisks or triangles quite rather than statues of soldiers. Though Southerners reasoned these actions were non-political acts of weeping, the female obviously saw themselves as veneration patriot heroes, although how nationality no much longer existed. Yet though as the females' associations decorated the cemeteries, some memorable efforts founded. Deceased in the 1880s, organizations of accomplice veterans became busy and began to build memorable statues of war and policy leaders. The basis of the Joint Daughters of the Confederation, UDC, in 1895 created a team of ladies concerned in celebrating the Confederation in schools and social spaces. Nearly of its commencement the UDC took a more than confrontational color rather than the LMAs. Of efforts to portray bondage as a type, delicate establishment and exit as inflicted by Constitution questions, the daughters estimated which historiographer Karen Cox has named a part of acknowledgement, that famed the fairness of the loose reason, and crusade for whites' leadership. By the 1890s, accomplice perpetuation was driving of the graveyard to the court building box, and these efforts proceeded brush in the growth of segregationist and the disfranchisement of African Americans. White Southerners showed their force by dominant social area in military monuments, the accomplice man protecting the town or the accomplice official on his gallant horse. By 1914, the UDC succeeded in placement a accomplice monument image on the perspectives of Arlington domestic graveyard as a souvenir to the joint state. And in the 1920s and 1930s, the flooding of accomplice sculpture extended. Richard Poplick, for an sample of how to release social spaces of a cruel history, see to Southward Africa at the end of apartheid in 1990. Southward Africa was leftward in above 3,600 statues presenting the main figures of colonization and apartheid, on in multiple memorials celebrating Afrikaner or British fame. Hundreds include with been disassembled. Largest include no. Toppling statues did not drop during Nelson Mandela's bound nationality story, nor did its circulation to democratic states' previous leaders, who were more than concentrated on conciliation rather than on renovation. Though by the action, which was a image of colonization's banner boy, Cecil John Rhodes, making on the College of Cloak City's college campus, wherever dark Southward Africans, by far the demographics most, were imaginary to sense smart fed. Through the nation, a motion bubbled to lifetime, a motion how culminated in the deterioration of the Rhodes image on March 9, 2015. Down there was thing mightily transforming on undergraduate activists dousing the images skirting inhumane feces. There was the time while Southward African social area was declared of apartheid and colonization's bronze capture, the time while the history was both of nominally and virtually dirty, and the at first born stairs in the direction actual statehood were undertaken. And there was not fair a undergraduate motion. A year up the Rhodes image's deterioration, brand opposition political figure Julia Malema, in his inauguration address to Parliament, had named for the logging of a statue of Louis Botts, Southward Africa's at first main secretary. Malema was progressive in reason known to lot Americans inviting for statues presenting historic figures of the Confederation to be remote. It is human beings love, Botts, who done whites Southward Africans believe they are excellent, he told, or if we go on celebration them, we are alike immortalizing whites' leadership. The image of Botts' external parliament must go downward, since it represents anything of which a more democratic Southward Africa stands to. Was Malema not hopeful fair else copy of left-hander college campus snowflakism? Or, worst, was there not an erase of story, requested his critics, a hazardous exception of the nation's history how presented the next to Rhodes like demagogues? Independently, defacing the UCT image immediately ignited the Rhodes must drop motion, and on in it a campaigning needing not just the destroying of the statues themselves, but as well the white supremacist institutions for that they stipulated symbolical counterweight. This remove of the image will not be the end of the motion, but quite the start of the decolonization of the college, recite UCT Rhodes must drop's mission statement declaration. Through Southward African campuses, telephone call for the destroying of statues became a urge for a reorganization of the position apartheid college, more than dark professors, more than African-focused syllabi. The morphed in demands for complementary insignificant formation for the nation's generally impoverished, generally dark students. Though following the Rhodes image was remote by the college's authorities on April 9, 2015, uprisings through Southward Africa rendered campuses regularly uncontrollable. New bookstores, new literature festivals, completely new lexicons were unborn. It has not been a neat or a enjoyable trial, love all revolutions, it has sometimes tilted above enforceable personality parody. But in eventually address Southward Africa's dissemination of colonialist statues, social spaces are proper unshackled of the cruelty of the history. Maybe, in period, the social reason will pursue. Richard Poplick is a elder reporter at Southward Africa's Everyday Wanderer news story and analyze website. Sisanki Misimang, which us can find out of number Rhodes must fall as Americans grip in which to do in statues and monuments celebration separating historic figures, they may be concerned in training of the Southward African expertise. The issues at act in Charlottesville were resembling of such how sparked the number Rhodes must fall motion, that began at the College of Cloak City in previous 2015. Debates on the heritage of Cecil John Rhodes and his location in southward African community were strong and frequently emotional, yet they, in comparison with the scenes of Charlottesville, were substantially nonviolent. In southward Africa, the shove to drag downward the image of Rhodes sparked a public motion how modified the mental scenery of the nation. Ripping downward the statues and change the names was just an accession spot, enabling undergraduate activists to address the absence of advance in the employing and retaining of dark academia personnel, the Eurocentric syllabus and the sluggish advance in manufacturing college formation available to dark youthful in a nation in blossoming joblessness and top levels of poverty reduction. More than importantly, at a domestic standard, the militancy associated to colonialist and apartheid-era attribute constrained southward Africans to think the next again. Encouraged by their successes, students through campuses in southward Africa were capable to articulate a new sight for their community how was strikingly various of how that Nelson Mandela had set out for the nationality in the previous 1990s. Instead of pardon, the students preached judiciary. They stretched off of dialogue in whites and focused instead of on the multitude ways in that racist continues to manifest himself in the southward African economics in ways how gain the whites minority group. Down there are lot similar elements among the US and southward Africa. Both of countries are persecuted by racist and both of nations include manufactured inspirational leaders who include disputed the calamity. Maybe largest importantly, both of countries are acknowledged globally as essential constitution democracies. Southward Africa's basic law may be junior rather than America's, but its achieve is profound and broad. It was precise the 1 week how down there are extensive differences among the Constitution rights Americans and southward Africans' importance. A distinctive mark of person freedom, the order to be unpleasant, seems to be increasing in significance in America, fueled no question by the growth of CEO Donald Trump card. The Indicate strip was on screen in Charlottesville among the white supremacists. The was to be anticipated, explicit racists are rarely nested in creature pleasant. Which is particularly restless are the astounding similar elements among the invader of the whites building and the bigot combatants who went to war to defend a brilliant history how never existed. In the 1 week's events, Mr. Trump card seems devoted to expansion the gap among America and its grandeur.